All right. Well, good morning, everybody. Thank you for having me back. Great to be back here in Delta. This morning, I thought we'd talk about working with defiant behavior with that. And as always, or as we did last time, if you've got questions, feel free to ask your questions. I love your questions, and I learn from your questions. And not only ask your questions, that's okay. But also share. But also, my phone does that sometimes too. And I don't know why. It's just crazy. It's all good.
It was in my pocket. I have no idea what I did. Sorry.
Or I'll set my directions and I'll go into the convenience store and it's still giving me directions while I'm walking around the store saying, turn here, turn there. But anyway, not only ask your questions, but share your expertise as well. Share your expertise so that we can learn kind of here locally maybe who are your go-to people for behavior or go-to people for mental health. And so share your expertise and your stories, not just asking your questions with that as we go through. And so we're going to talk about kind of the nature of students and talk about different types of aspects that might look like defiant behavior in that kind of context. We're going to talk about maybe the nature of teachers and sometimes why we want compliance and what does compliance look like. And compliance is a needed skill, and we'll talk about why it's needed and why it's an important skill with that. And then we'll talk about the effectiveness of child management methods with that and the student environment. And then we'll wrap it up with the very behavioral approach to how do we work with compliance for students. And that's kind of our agenda for the day. Before we get started, are there any questions that you have or anything you're hoping I'm going to cover or talk about as we go through and talk about defiant behavior?
I did send him all of the questions that you guys posted on the feedback.
And that's why I picked this particular presentation, is based on all the feedback that you provided. I looked through everything that I have, and this one sounded like it would be the most relevant to the feedback or the questions that you provided in that context. So it's not random that I chose this. I chose this very intentional based on your feedback, because I can stand up here and talk a lot, but if it's not relevant to your needs, it may not mean anything in that context, and I want it to be relevant to your needs. And so based on your questions, but before we get started, do you have anything additional you wanted to add in there, or you're hoping that I'm going to talk about? Yes?
Is this available at that link at the bottom?
This right here, link at the bottom, this is the resource where I got this information from. So you will have the PowerPoint slides. I've already emailed them out. And so I'll make sure that they're accessible to you. This is just where I got this information from. So if you say, well, where did Bill make this up? No, I didn't make it up. You can click on this link and it'll take you, and you can look at where all this information came from. And I try to be diligent and cite my sources, so it's not just me making up stuff, because that can get weird sometimes or whatever with that. But yes. Yeah. But great question. Other questions? All right. So we're talking about the nature of the student. The first thing you want to do when you look at defiance behavior is you want to kind of create or think about a compliance scale with that, ranging from overly compliant on the left to oppositional defiant on the right, and in between those extremes are behaviors generally deemed acceptable, including that. And so what you want to do is most people use a scale from 1 to 10 with that. And when you're looking at that student, I want to kind of gauge where they at on that compliance scale, because that'll determine where I need to intervene in that process with it. And the reason that becomes important is because on that scale, you might have a strong-willed child in that context. And if you have that strong-willed child, they're usually viewed as non-compliant or defiant in that place with that. And it's important because many youth with learning disabilities or attention deficit disorder might be described as that strong-willed place. Is anybody familiar with temperament? Okay. So The general consensus is that temperament is hardwired, that we're biologically hardwired for our temperament. And you can have a shy and cautious temperament. You could have a flexible and easygoing temperament, or you could have a high energy or feisty temperament in that place. And usually when it comes to temperament, whatever temperament you are, you tend to view everybody else through that temperament and have that expectation that they're that same temperament in that process. And so if you look at temperament, the strong-willed would be the high energy, high feisty child in that context. And so you want to look at, before I do compliance training, is this student simply that temperament, that high feisty or strong-willed temperament in that place, because that might be part of that biologically pre-wired place, rather than a behavior that I need to program for in that context. And so just keep in mind that temperament might play a small part in this context, and so we may not want to do a behavior program if you're trying to adjust their temperament. The research has shown that environment has little impact on temperament. In that context. So regardless of the parenting or the parenting style, that's not going to impact a person's temperament. So you want to just kind of keep that in mind. Any questions about temperament, or anybody want to add something additional to temperament? Okay. The other one, they might have poor organizational skills, poor time management skills, impulsivity, low self-esteem in there. And so that might often look like non-compliance, where it's not really that they're non-compliant. They just don't know how to organize their time or organize their activities or their materials. They don't know how to manage time effectively in that context. And so another thing you might want to look at before going down the road of doing compliance training is, are we looking at that strong-willed? Are we looking at organizational skill deficits in that place? A student's set of complex tasks required by teachers either lacks organization with that, or maybe it's impulsivity, that they're highly impulsive or highly emotional. And that's what looks like non-compliant behavior. Usually when you're talking about that impulsivity, it's usually that heightened emotional response, where your first response you get is that emotion with it. And so that's why you want to have that continuum of where does a student follow on that continuum. Are they have that temperament? Are they disorganized? Do they have high impulsive behaviors with that? And with the high impulsive, have you guys ever looked at like academic data, and you ever seen academic data where it's like all over the place? One day they have a really low score, and then they're really high score, and a really low score, and there's no consistency, and they're kind of all over the map with that. When you see data like that, that's usually that sign of that impulsivity, that sign of that emotional aspect. That emotion is really kind of driving their behavior, and it's that impulse of, I felt sad or off today, so I had a low score. I felt really good today, so then I had a high score in that context. And so if you have that high variability, then you're probably looking at that impulsive nature and that emotional, and then you would more be appropriate to look at that serious emotional disability IEP category, and how are we going to address that emotional impulsivity rather than looking at it maybe from a behavioral perspective. Looking at the nature of the teacher, how great is the teacher's need for control? So take that into kind of consideration with that process. And this kind of goes to every time things start to fall apart or things don't go my way, I, as a teacher, begin to panic a little bit. And what happens when I panic? What do I want? I want control. Because what does control make me feel? Feel stable, feel safe. Makes me feel like I'm maybe doing my job. Or because I'm the adult and I'm in charge of the environment, I'm supposed to have control over this particular environment. So everybody, and this is just something we naturally do, is when things start to get a little chaotic, our answer to fixing that is we want to control that situation. And we want to kind of be in charge because we don't know what else to do to make it feel safe and feel comfortable in that context. And so before you go down the road of compliance training, you want to look at how great is the teacher's need to have that control and related to that. And so really it's about us as adults learning to be okay without having control over everything all the time. In that context. Usually what I share with parents and I share with teachers is that sometimes parents feel totally responsible for their kids' behavior. They're at school, I feel totally responsible if they're misbehaving, it's because I'm a bad parent, okay? Well, parents can influence and guide their children, but you can't control the child. I can't make my child do any particular thing in that context. So as a teacher, you can influence and you can guide, but you really can't make them do anything in that context. And so it's about understanding when we talk about control, it's really about our ability to influence children or to guide children in a particular direction. It's not about making them do things. And when we get in that panic mode of ourselves, we want to control things, we want to make them behave in certain ways in that context. So it's just kind of help frame that perspective. What's the caregiver's primary leadership style? Different people have different leadership styles, and so that's important. Behaviorally, they call it contextual fit. I can write really great behavior programs, but if I write them for my skill and ability level, I guarantee you they're not going to be implemented with any type of fidelity or success. When I write a behavior program, I got to take into consideration what's the teacher's personality. What is the teacher already using in the context of the classroom that I can build on or attach to? Because if I write it around what I believe and how I feel, and this gets into my implicit bias, I may not get that fidelity of implementation. And so we need to know what the leadership style of the teacher is. And if it's being implemented by a paraeducator, maybe we need to look at what is the style of the paraeducator and what are they comfortable with and how does that fit into that process. What are teachers' management styles and practices and how do they impact student compliance? That might get back to classroom management. Do they have, what kind of classroom management skills are we looking at? Sometimes I get asked to go in and observe a student and I walk in and as the adult I become dysregulated in the classroom because there's a lot going on and it's really kind of chaotic. And if I as an adult are dysregulated and I've got lots of coping skills, I can't imagine what that student feels like. And so maybe my starting point for my behavior intervention is, let's get your classroom management style figured out and under control. I worked with one teacher who had 7 research-based phenomenal interventions going on, but they were trying to do 7 at the same time. It didn't work. To do that. So it's like, okay, that's great that you got into the research-based interventions. Let's pick 1, maybe 2. Let's get really good at those, and then we'll see what's happened. So in some cases, it might be I need to look at classroom management first, and then after I've got the classroom managed and we're in a good place, then if that student still sticks out, I can come back and say, let's work with that particular student. But sometimes I might need to get that classroom management piece under control first with that. So then I would look at, do we have strategies in place? If the strategy is working, or why isn't it working? And then is there consistent implementations? That's looking at fidelity of implementation. Are we implementing that on a consistent, regular basis? And when we talk about fidelity, it's about, are we doing what we said we were going to do? So a lot of times on paper we write these nice plans, but then in reality it looks a little different than what we put on the piece of paper. And so really what you want to do is you want to capture what we're really doing rather than what looks nice on that kind of paper process, so we have that fidelity. And does the consequence fit the crime, so to speak? That is the concept. If you're going to put consequences in place, the consequences should be relevant to what you're working on. The easiest example of that is sometimes as a parent, I would ground my kids from TV for a month for something that they did. Okay? And what the research says is that shorter time frames are more impactful than larger time frames. Because at the end of that month, they're like, oh, now what was I grounded for? I don't remember what I did. It started to lose this kind of potential or the connection to that relationship. And a month later, what have I really done? I really punished myself. Because that means I've got to police them from not watching TV. And if I watch it and they're watching with me, then that's a whole nother story in that context. But the research says it'd be better for me to ground them for 1 or 2 days a week, maybe. The general rule of thumb is how old are they? That's how many minutes that so if they're 6, you're looking at 6 minutes or maybe 6 hours in that context. And so you want to keep that more in that short and to make sure that the consequence matches what the offense that's happened in that context. Okay? Questions about that one? Thoughts about that one? I could tell people are connecting to it. That's why I'm asking. So I'm not the only parent who's punished myself more than my child. Okay. It's good to know. Okay. For some students who are incredibly affected by the environment might be driving their behavior in that context. And so how does the environment impacting them? That might be the lighting may not be great in the particular classroom. Schools are great at having fluorescent lights. Most every school I go to has fluorescent lights. Fluorescent lights aren't great. They can be overwhelming from a sensory perspective. They have a little bit of a flicker. I can't see it. But if you've got somebody who's kind of maybe prone to seizure disorders, that might be enough to trigger that piece. And they have a little bit of a hum in the ballast. I can't hear it, but for some students, fluorescent lights might be a little overwhelming. So it's how can I bring in natural light or lamps or some other type of lighting source for them. Visually, sometimes I go in and I see these wonderfully decorated classrooms, and every inch of every wall is decorated with something. That can be visually overstimulating. That can be too much for them to take in. And if I'm busy looking at everything on the wall and trying to process that, I may not be able to focus on the teacher and have that connection with them. So think about the visual space and what I have and what am I decorating with it. It might be the temperature. I've had students who had very narrow temperature ranges. My middle son has a very narrow temperature range where if it's too hot or too cold, that creates different behaviors. So what's the temperature in the room or temperature in the environment? Maybe they're hungry, or maybe they have some kind of emotional needs in that. For your younger children or the preschool, we would talk about the trust cycle with that. And the trust cycle is I have an expressed need, and I express that need. If my needs are met, then I build that safe attachment, that safe connection, that safe relationship in the context. What makes the need cycle or the trust cycle hard is eventually students add wants into that need cycle. So then you have to differentiate what is a need and what is a want. If you want to build that relationship and have that secure attachment, you want to make sure you're always meeting their needs. And sometimes their need might be attention. Sometimes it might need connection. Trauma-informed care would say that if you're looking at attention as a function of behavior, what they're really wanting is connection with an adult. They want a relationship in that process with it. And you got to separate that from what they want versus what they need, because it's not good for them to always get what they want. When they have wants, that's when you set boundaries and you teach them how to accept a no answer or a no response. So you're making sure you're meeting the needs, not always the wants. It's okay to get a want every once in a while, but that's where you're going to set boundaries in that context. And so this is where this part here comes, the hunger, and this is all about meeting those basic needs in that concept. Questions about that? Thoughts about that? Yes.
I would just say, the one thing that you just said really just struck me, and I just kind of wanted to underline it,
Mhm.
You said if a child is seeking attention, if that's what we found in an FBA, that the child is seeking attention, that what they're really looking for is a connection.
Yes.
And I think that that's really, really important, because I think sometimes our maybe our go-to is, well, all they want is attention, so I don't want to, I don't want to feed into that too much.
Right.
What they really need is like a real connection with that teacher, or I just thought
And
that was really
that's a great point, because a trauma-informed care team, what there really is that personal connection. From a behavioral perspective, what we're going to do is only give them attention when they engaging in the behavior we want to see. So that would be a behavioral approach. And that's why some of your trauma-informed practices push against your pure behavioral approach and would say that you're re-traumatizing that student, because if they're really looking for that connection, and behaviorally what I do is I cut off attention, then I'm just expanding that need for that connection and that relationship and that piece with the context, which is why it's important to go back and kind of sort this out and figure out what you're looking at and what you're dealing with. And so behaviorally, to do it right, you would use what? Planned ignoring or extinction, which is really about ignoring the inappropriate behavior. It's not about ignoring the student, but sometimes we misapply that concept with this. So we can still pay attention to the student, and I can still connect and have a relationship with the student while ignoring the behavior. An example of that I usually give, and if you give me pushback, that's okay, is cussing behavior. So if a student starts cussing at me, if I do planned ignoring, I'm going to ignore the cussing behavior. That doesn't mean I ignore the student. So I still want to talk to the student. I still want to say, oh, you sound angry today. You sound frustrated today. That's me building that connection, building that relationship, feeding that relationship need. I'm going to pretend like they didn't cuss at all. I might pick out 3 different things that they've said, and I might reflect those 3 different things they said without paying attention to the cussing behavior. And what feedback or pushback do I get against that? The other students having to hear it, and now I'm condoning cussing, right? I'm allowing cussing in that concept. And so in the immediacy of that, I'm denying them the behavioral response. What's the behavioral response? What kind of response are they looking at from me as an adult? What do they want me to do when they cuss? They want me to get angry. They want me to lecture them. They want me to roll my eyes or take a deep sigh, or they want to see my face get red. My face gets red really easy, so that used to be something fun for kids to try to do. So they were trying to push my buttons. So planned ignoring is, I'm not going to give you that lecture. I'm not going to give you, hopefully my face doesn't turn red. I don't know, it might still anyway. But I'm not going to give you that sigh or that roll in my eyes and that concept. So I'm cutting out the rewarding part of the cussing, which is watching you get upset and watching you, that's the reward for that place. So I'm getting rid of that. That doesn't mean I'm going to condone cussing. What that means is after the student is calm and I don't have an audience, now I can talk about cussing behavior with that student and whether how do we change it, how do we fix it. Maybe 2 days later I have a whole class discussion with the students and we talk about appropriate language and we talk about cussing. So it's not that I don't address it. In the immediacy of that crisis, I don't want to address that, and that's the behavioral part of ignoring. But where people misinterpret that is they ignore the person. You can't ignore the student, because if you ignore the student will increase their behavior until you're forced to, they'll make it a safety issue until you're forced to pay attention to them. So don't ignore the student. So it brings back to, I can still connect with them, even though behaviorally I'm not going to reinforce that behavior and that concept. Yes?
Okay, so you tell me what I did right or wrong.
Okay.
So we have a new student 3 weeks before the end of this semester. And our sped para worked with her a couple of times we use a Wilson Fluency for reading for like 5 minutes. at the beginning of our time with her. And our parent would be like, oh, she's doing great, she's no problem, da da da. Okay, so this one day I'm gonna do Wilson fluency with her. First time I've worked with her. So we get so we put it down and she's like, oh, and she comes from reading intervention. And she's had no problems with the parrot, so all working good. Okay, so get out your Wilson fluency book. We're gonna do your Wilson fluency. Whatever. Okay, so she gets it out and we're gonna read, she read her words for me. They're 2 word lists, no problem. Now we're gonna do the phrasing. And there's the little scoopy lines underneath, so please take your finger and put it underneath the first scoop and run your finger under as you do the phrases. And she looks at it, and I get the timer ready, and I said, are you ready? And she said, yes. And I said, please put your finger under the scoop, first scoop, and she picks up the book. I'm like, okay, whatever. So I said, ready, begin. And she holds the book up, and she reads for the 15 seconds. I'm like, okay. So she puts it down, and I record her time, and so we're going to do the second phrase. I said, this time I'd like you to put your book down on the table, and I want you to put your finger underneath the first scoop to begin, and I want you to follow with your finger the scoops. That's what I did last time. No, actually you held your book up, and you didn't do that. How do you know I didn't do this with my thumb? I'm like, because
right.
I know you didn't. She goes, please put your book on the table and follow along with your finger. Blam went the book. And then she takes her pencil, blam underneath the scoop lines. I said, how are you going to follow your scoops when your pencil's on top of with your finger, with your pencil's on top of the lines? Well, that's what I'm going to use. Okay. I would prefer that you use your finger like I asked you to. I don't want to do that. Well, this isn't exactly what you want to do. This is what I asked you to, very nicely to do. She moves her face, and she puts her finger there. Are you ready? Begin. And I start the timer, and she starts reading, but she doesn't move her finger. Oh, honey, this is so much fun. And so I read the time, I stopped the time, and I recorded her words. And I said, she says, are we done? Well, now we're going to do the phrased reading for the passage. She's like so over this, and I'm so over this as well, but we have this next thing we're going to do. And so I said, okay, we're going to read, for 60 seconds this time. Please put your finger underneath this, where the phrasing scoop starts. And she takes her fist and she smashes it down on top of the book. And I said, oh, did that hurt? And she goes, no. And I said, okay, well, that's not exactly what I asked you to do. Please put your finger under the scoop on, where you're supposed to start, and then begin reading. And she didn't move her hand at all. And I said, if you'd rather not use your finger, you can use your pencil with your eraser, or you can use your pen as long as you're not writing on the book. And so she did take her pencil with the eraser, and then she followed along with her eraser, and we got it done. And I said, thank you very much for following along with the thing. And for me, it was like a battle of wills. Like, I didn't lose my temper. But I wanted her to know that this was a task she had to do.
Mm-hmm.
And it was my first time working with her.
Mm-hmm.
I wasn't going to chew her out, because that wouldn't have done anything. She was going to remain separate. She was going to remain, she wanted to be in charge. And then the next time
and if you chewed her out, that's her expectation.
Well, exactly. And the next time that we met 2 days later, and we sat down, and I said, if we get it out, and she did. And I said, do you remember how I expect you to read these phrases? And she said yes. And I said, okay. And so she put her finger there, and then she did it.
Mm-hmm.
And so I feel like I did the right thing. But is there a better way that I could have done that?
Sounds like you did a good job. The first thing I would look at is ask her, has she done this before or had bad experience? I would.
She'd done it twice with the para, and no gerbil.
Okay, right.
I don't know what it was about.
To build that connection point, what I would do is I would ask her, well, what do you have some kind of anxiety around this, or is this a struggle, or is it because you don't know who I am as a person? And so the connection piece, I would read that anxiety as maybe I don't know you, I don't trust you, you're somebody new. Let's build that relationship and that connection to it. So I would maybe pause that and take a little time to build that connection and that relationship.
Honestly, I was
With that. And so I would just take that pause and see that, well, according to trauma-informed care, they're trying to connect with you, but they don't know who you are, or they don't have a connection or relationship with them. So just a few minutes to connect and build that relationship with them. And then once you start down the process, you did a good job of you don't want to negotiate with them in that concept. The other part is, instead of telling them they did something wrong, stay away from you didn't do it right or you held the book up. But use it from the concept of, this is what I want you to do. I need to be able to see you move your thumb from place to place with that. And then adding in there praise. Oh, you put your book down. Thank you for doing that. Praising them for doing that. Oh, you put the pencil where I wanted to. I don't want you to use the pencil, but you're this be a shaping concept where you have an approximation of what I want, so I'm going to reward that approximation. Then I might say, can you flip it around and use the eraser of that context? And so all the way through, making sure I praised every approximation of compliance all the way through. But you did the right thing in not negotiating with her. Because if she negotiates, then she says, oh, I gotcha. Everything's going to be negotiable after that piece. And so I would start with, how do I just do a quick connection point in a relationship, and then make sure that I become a broken record around what I expect, not what don't I want you to do. And then make sure I praise any approximation of it. And so that's would be the feedback that I have. I don't know if that's helpful or not helpful.
Yeah.
Anybody else have feedback?
Well, all of that, but I also wonder how important it is to know the background of that student before you start teaching with them.
Mm-hmm.
You know, even if it's a quick file review or talk to last year's teacher, but you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, but she was a transfer student.
I know,
So,
yeah, it's hard. Not that you're doing stuff. But as much as you can, I think that helps too. You know?
And then the other part we're going to talk about here, and just as you said, punishment isn't going to get you anything in that concept. So thank you for not going down that particular road. Anybody else have other thoughts about that they'd like to share? Yes.
Adding in some of the choice.
Mm-hmm.
You can do it with your pen, you can do it with your pen.
Yes.
It seems like that may have even kind of helped us.
Adding
You
it
gave her
in.
some of the control, but you gave her that,
Right.
you were still in control of the situation. It was still what you were allowing.
Right, because you can still provide choices. You can use your pencil, you can use your finger. If you want to use your whole fist and exert a lot of effort, that's okay. You can do that, providing that sense of choice in that particular concept. And it also might be, let's just practice this skill set before we do the testing piece, and I'm going to practice it, and then we'll start, maybe the timer is the problem. Maybe it's the pressure of having to perform under the use of the context of the timer. So can we do it without the timer first and just practice that skill set? And once we get that skill set, and then maybe the timer is creating the anxiety with it. So maybe as the teacher, I can time you without knowing that you're being timed. I'll start the timer so that and won't make a big deal or issue out of it. So it really depends on kind of where that, it sounds like there was some anxiety, and where's that anxiety come from? Other thoughts or other suggestions people might have? Thank you for bringing that up, though, and thank you for sharing. I appreciate that very much. That was awesome in doing that. And impulsivity, you want to, if there is impulsivity, you want to do what they call a trigger analysis with that, and recognizing the triggers in that particular piece. So even if we talk about that same example that we just used, and we see that resistance is a little bit of anxiety, what was the trigger? Was the trigger the timer? Was the trigger the change in person or individual? Was the trigger that I had an unknown person that I was working with for the first time in that concept? Was the trigger, that you're trying to assess me and figure out what makes me tick, and I don't want you to know what I can and can't do? Or the trigger might be, maybe it was insulting for me to have to move my finger out there, or I felt silly doing that because maybe my skill's more advanced than what that process is, that concept. Sometimes, I don't know if you've ever worked with gifted and talented students, they will show you one time what they can do, and if you ask them in the future to repeat that, chances are they're not going to do that for you. They'll do it one time, and then that's it. They're not going to repeat the skill set for you over and over in that context because they kind of find it insulting that you're going back in that place. And so even in this example, going back and doing a trigger analysis in that particular situation, what set off that particular behavior. So if I was going to problem solve that, this might be my first step, is how do I do a trigger analysis in that situation. And there's a lot of different things that could be triggering it. It's about sorting out what was the trigger in that particular process with it. And then it might be just explaining, well, this is a specific method or approach, and I know it feels kind of funny, or I feel funny, you can validate with them, but this is the approach we need to use for this assessment to be valid in that concept. And so it's about processing those challenges with it. And then if it is that anxiety with the stress, teaching relaxation skills and then preparing them for that transition process with it. So the first thing I would want to do is what were the triggers, and then I would teach them how to resolve that anxiety in that context. So that first time when they started doing that anxiety toward the test, I might have done some progressive relaxation where we could have sat there and we could have tightened all of our muscles and then let our muscles go just as a quick way to re-regulate their emotions. Or we could have got a drink of water or something to help regulate those emotions. So this is just a way to take that situation and kind of analyze it and kind of how do we apply some of this process. Questions about this piece here, about doing a trigger analysis? Yes.
I would say one thing that I hear a lot from our folks is that sometimes you have no idea what the trigger is.
Yes.
And you try and analyze it, and you talk about it as a team, and you have no idea.
That is a great question, because there are three different types of triggers. Usually when you're talking about behavior, the trigger is in the immediate environment, and that trigger might be, I gave you a work assignment, you didn't want to do it, you tore it up, and so the trigger was me giving you that work assignment. Those are easy to observe. Sometimes you might have what they call a slow burning trigger, and that slow burning trigger might be 30 minutes ago, a peer called them a name 30 minutes ago or insulted them 30 minutes ago. They sat and they thought about it for 30 minutes. And then during that 30-minute time, they ramped up, and they became more and more angry as they processed that. And then the teacher says something small, and then the student kind of explodes in that process. So they didn't see the trigger in the environment, because the trigger was a peer said something negative to me a half hour or an hour before the explosion happened in that concept. And so you have slow burning triggers. You have triggers in the environment. The other type of triggers you might have is it might be internalized. It's a thought or a feeling or an emotion that triggered that particular behavior in that context with that. And so the thought might be, this is not expressed, but the thought might be, does the teacher think I can't read? And that's why they want me to move their finger under it, or whatever the case may be. So in that case, it might be a thought or an emotion that was that trigger piece. And so when doing that trigger analysis, part of it might be, I need you to verbally express your thoughts and your feelings in that context, because I can't see your internal thought processes and what's happening in that context with it. So that's when I might have a conversation and say, well, what were your thoughts when I was asking you to do this activity? What were your thoughts? What were you thinking about? Oh, I was thinking about this past time when I had this teacher who, okay. And so I triggered this past teacher experience that you've had in the past with that. Or it might be, I was getting tired. We did all this work with the para, and now I'm feeling tired, and I just needed a break with that to go from one to the other with that. So sometimes you might have to have that conversation with them to get them externalize their thought processes and get them to externalize what kind of feeling they were having. In order to do that, though, you got to teach them emotional vocabulary. I don't know if anybody's familiar with Mark Brackett. He works at the Yale University. He wrote the mood meter and the ruler curriculum. And his research, he would say the average adult can only label 6 emotions. And so you got to teach that emotional vocabulary in that context. And the concept is, if all I know is angry, then I have one behavioral response for angry. But if I know that I can be irritated, upset, frustrated, annoyed, and those are all different intensity levels of anger, now I can have a different behavioral response for each intensity level in that place. And so you get them to label their emotions, get them to share their thought processes about what's happening, and that's how you get to some of those triggers. If I remember right, you guys did CPI, right? Okay. Sometimes when they teach CPI, they talk about precipitating factors as being the real reason students have behaviors. Some instructors will take a pop can and they'll start it at one end of the room, and they say, as you hear something negative, shake it up. Okay? And so they'll say, we got up late. Yeah, shake up the pop can. And then they pass it to the next person. Oh, we missed breakfast. You shake up the pop can. All right, and then we missed the bus. Shake up the pop can. Mom and Dad had to take me to school. Shake the pop can. I got to the school, then I had to explain to the attendance person why I'm late to get a pass. You shake up the pop can. I walk into the classroom and the teacher says hi. It's like the pop can just got opened, and what happens to it if you shake a pop and you open the pop can? It explodes. And so where was the trigger? The trigger is way back when I got out of bed this morning, rather than it being immediately in the environment. So when you're talking about behavioral, they're looking at what they call an ABC analysis, which is looking at the trigger being in the environment. Sometimes the trigger's not in the environment. And as we talked about last time on our crisis cycle, we talked about how they come into your classroom hypervigilant. It might be that the rest of that cycle happened before they ever got to your room or your place in that process, which is why the trigger analysis becomes important. Maybe we didn't see that trigger. If we didn't see it, it could be a delayed, or it could be a thought or internalized, and that's why we need to do this trigger analysis to figure out where did that trigger happen, or where did that trigger come from. And that's challenging. I make it maybe sound easy when I talk about it. It's hard to do, to find what that trigger is. Even as adults, sometimes we're not aware of what triggers our behavior in that context. I don't know if anybody's ever worked with Dr. Laura Riffle, the behavioral doctor. She had a student that she was working with, and they just couldn't figure out what the trigger was. The student would, some days he'd have great days, some days he'd have violent, aggressive days, and they couldn't figure it out. It took them like 6 months, and eventually he figured out it was the teacher's perfume. That was the trigger for the behavior. And what was it about the teacher's perfume? It was the same perfume Mom used to wear, and Mom was very abusive to the student. And so when the teacher wore that same perfume, the smell reminded him of Mom, And that was the trigger for their behavior, having a bad day because mom was very abusive. Mom was no longer in the picture anymore, but that smell was what the trigger was. And so as soon as the teacher stopped wearing that perfume, they didn't have behavior problems because it wasn't being triggered anymore. So it's not easy, and behavioral theory is sometimes we want to simplify things in black and white terms. Usually it's more complex than that. And so it's really about how do we identify those triggers. I don't know if any of that's helpful or not helpful, but looking at the 3 different types, you really got to spend some time to investigate what is that trigger point going to be.
And that's
Yes.
kind of what I meant by background.
Yes.
You know,
Okay.
and I should have said triggers, but yeah, when people say we don't know what the triggers are, then it's our job to try and figure it out. But it could be all of those things or just one of those things that may have, triggered the non-behavior.
Absolutely. Could be multiple, or it could be just one little small thing that's triggered that behavior. And doing the background analysis, that might help you figure out the triggers. Parents are going to be good at helping you figure out the triggers. Parents may have already figured out what some of these triggers are in that context, so having a conversation with parents might be really good to understand what those triggers are as well. Absolutely. So triggers are hard. They're difficult with that, and they may not always be obvious in the moment with that. I don't know if anybody's ever done a chain analysis, which is a training topic for a different time. It comes from dialectical behavioral therapy. It's very similar to your ABC behavioral analysis, and dialectical behavioral theory is grounded in behavioral theory, but the chain analysis takes into consideration thoughts, and it takes into consideration feelings and emotions when you're doing a chain analysis. And it also, instead of being in the immediate environment, you can do a chain analysis over the course of a day or an extended time period in that context, rather than it being in the immediate environment. And so usually if I'm having trouble figuring out what the trigger is, I would do a chain analysis process. Maybe one of our breaks I'll pull up a slide that'll show you what that looks like. But it's a little bit more in depth than maybe the traditional behavioral analysis piece. Questions about triggers?
The teachers that tell the kids what the teacher's triggers are,
Yeah.
when kid does something, the teacher says, don't do that because that makes me whatever. It's kind of like you're telling the kids where your triggers are.
Absolutely. And then the student's like, I got your number. If I need to make you upset, I know what to do. In that context, Dr. Laura Riffle refers to it as people were like vending machines, and we all have buttons. And what is the student first thing they want to do? They want to figure out what your buttons are. Because if I can push your buttons, that's my way to influence you. That's my way to get what I want in that process. So even that non-compliant behavior that you're talking about earlier, maybe the goal was, I want to figure out what your buttons are. I want to figure out what gets you mad and upset, and I want to figure out what gets me out of doing work. And once they figure it didn't work, like, oh, okay, that's good. I will share, I apologize, it's a little bit of a crude example. There was a middle school student, who used to have problems with urinating and feces and making messes. And why did he do this? Because it grossed out staff. That's why he did that. Okay? Came to my school one time, and I was working with him, and he's like, I'm going to pee on, pull down his pants, I'm going to pee on you. I said, okay, I don't care. I'll get a mop and broom, you can clean it up. Put his pants back up, didn't have a problem with him ever in that particular school with that kind of problem. He went to another school, they had all kinds of problem with it. Why? Because it grossed staff out, and staff's response was, oh, don't do that. I didn't give him that response. I said, okay, whatever, I don't care. I've been peed on before. I can get peed on again. Doesn't matter. It's all good, I gave him an unexpected response, and I took the power away, so he knew that wasn't a button of mine, and he didn't push it. So when students know, they try to figure out what your buttons are. When they figure out what your buttons are, they're going to push your buttons. And if you tell them what your triggers are, you're setting yourself up for that. Other questions or other thoughts about that? All right. Compliance training can appear degrading and controlling. It's critical to be aware of this before getting started to ensure to carefully implement the strategies with that. So compliance training, if somebody is from the outside kind of looking in, not understanding what you're doing, it might seem crummy or yucky kind of to them. So just to keep that kind of in mind when you're doing compliance training with that. So before beginning compliance training, be very clear about why it's important and ensure that you're using the strategies to benefit the child, not for staff convenience or not because it benefits staff in some way, shape, or form with that. Questions about all that we're going to take into consideration before we begin compliance training? Yes?
I have a student that last year when I was working with him, every time I gave directions, he had a response. Why do I need to do this? What about this? What about this? How come this? When am I gonna, how come? How many times is it? And I said to him at one point, I don't understand why you feel the need, it feels like you need to challenge me on everything that I give you directions for. And he said, I'm not trying to challenge you, I'm just trying to understand. And I said, okay, that's good information for me.
Yes.
And I said, because I was getting really frustrated with this kid, because everything that came out of my mouth, I felt like he was trying to challenge me.
Yep.
And so me taking the time to ask him that question or to make that comment to him gave me that information. And so, because I was assuming that he just wanted to be in control or challenge me or whatever.
Yes.
And after that, getting that information, then it gave me the opportunity to change how I was giving directions, or then to ask more questions or give him more information with what I was doing. And totally changed my attitude and what I was doing in the first place.
Absolutely. I'm glad you brought that up because that changes your perspective. I once had a second grade teacher. The principal's like, I got to get rid of this second grade teacher. For the same reason you're talking about, this teacher asked a lot of questions, and the way the teacher asked the questions felt challenging or felt defiance of authority. But if you look at the teacher's data, this is one of the better teachers in the school that was getting lots of great results from those students. It's about a personality type. Some people need to have a lot of information or a lot of details to feel safe, to feel comfortable. If you take the Myers-Briggs, they would say whether you're a J or a P in that concept. And the difference between a J and a P is the P person, they're going to plan everything. So if you're going on a vacation, I have to have an agenda for my vacation. I have to know where I'm going to be, where I'm going to do, where I'm going to eat, and it has to be all planned out before I get there, and I have to have a packing list to make sure I pack everything. If you're a J, you're going to throw everything in your backpack or your duffel bag, walk out the door, and you're not going to care where you're going or where you're going to be or how you're going to get there in that concept. So for some people, they need that excruciating level of detail to be functional in that concept. And so if you want to understand that, they're not being non-compliant or they're not being defiant. They just need that level of detail to function. And so some people in their personality need that kind of level of detail to be functional. So thank you for bringing that particular up. Even if I look at my wife and I'm the one who, I'll pack a toothbrush and a shirt and I'll hit the road and life's good. My wife's like, no, I need to know where we're stopping for lunch. I need to know where we're stopping for dinner. I need to know how many hours we're going to drive and needs that all planned out. I used to get frustrated sometimes with my wife. It's like, can't we just go and do this? But I realized, no, for her to feel comfortable, I got to give her the details. And so if I want a successful conversation, if I plan out all the details which is exhausting for me because I'm not a detail person. Then I say, let's do this and here are all the details. That makes things more functional for her in that context. So it's really about that concept of that personality type. Do they need details or do they not? And how do I adjust my communication? You guys ever heard of emergenetics? They sometimes do emergenetics in schools. It talks about different work behavior, and the detailed person is your green structural person, and I discovered I got very little green in it. The four categories are your social, meaning you like to interact and talk, or you're visionary, where you can see the future, or connect the dots, or you have these plans, or you're very analytical. You like to do puzzles, and that green is your structure. That's your detailed mind and your brain. And the concept behind your dramatic is, for it to have an effective team, you need one person that has a strong skill set in each one of those four areas. Because if you have all social people, they'll sit together all day and talk, but nothing will get done. If you have all visionary people, they'll have all these great ideas, but nobody will ever put them in practice. You need the structured people to put them in practice and keep that kind of place. And so an effective team is one of those personalities. But the reason I bring that up is they have a whole different thing of how do you interact with different types of people. And I do have someplace the abbreviated version of the Myers-Briggs that you can take, and it'll tell you what your personality type is, and then how do you interact with other types. But again, a training for another time. Why don't we take a break before we jump